Welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Herb Williams-Dalgart, author of the novel Jingle Boys. Herb, welcome.
Hi, Colin. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, I want to just start with the main character of Jingle Boys, Wally Lipkin. What are the very challenging choices he's faced with?
Yeah, thanks. Wally is an interesting character. Wally is coming up on his 18th birthday in the year 1943, right after Roosevelt had lowered the draft age to 18. And that means he's facing deployment. He's also challenged by the fact that he has an anxiety condition that causes him to faint at very inopportune times. And it's starting to manifest itself even more as he's gotten older. So he's tried to keep it secret from others. And at that time, such a condition could keep you from being conscripted into the military, but it would also mean they would put you in the sanatorium to treat you for that condition. And so these are his choices: to enlist and get into the military, knowing that his condition might really bring the death of him, or to come clean about that condition and find himself locked away. And he happens to have an uncle who that happened to, and things did not turn out well for him. So these are his choices as we start the novel.
Yeah, so the condition is called anxiety neurosis. I'm not familiar with it. It did make me think a little bit as mental health is, people are more aware of mental health these days than probably back then.
Yeah.
How common of a condition was it at that time? Was it treatable? Obviously, you said he would might be sent to a sanatorium. How was it treated back then versus how is it treated today? Can you give us a little more context about this illness?
Yeah. This was one of the interesting parts of my research for this book, is particularly around how people with mental health were treated. And unfortunately, they were not treated well. I wrote Jingle Boys during the pandemic, when everyone felt anxious and suffered from some form of anxiety. But for folks like Wally, these conditions could be debilitating. I actually went to school with a guy and was in theater with him, and he had this condition. So imagine being stressed out as you are just before you take stage, and he would hyperventilate, he would pass out. I was his understudy, so it was just as nerve-wracking for me. Probably not just as, but close to nerve-wracking for me. And so this was a fairly debilitating disease. Now they deal with this with medications and therapies. And for people lucky enough to have access to that kind of care, they manage. But back then, it was a trip to the sanatorium. There was electroshock therapy. There was surgeries. There was really horrific treatments. And that doesn't include the social stigma that comes with it. People were not treated very well who had these conditions. And particularly at a time of war when bravery was expected from every young man, um, this was considered to be something not brave and something very damaging to them. So he had both the social challenges, Wally, and the physical challenges that came with such a disease at that time.
So Wally comes up with a very unique solution. Can you talk a little bit about what that solution was? I'm also curious to know, was it based in actual historical events, or is it just something you made up?
Yeah, great question. So for Wally, the luck comes when he finds out that there's a local radio station, his favorite radio station, is having a jingle contest. He happens to be an excellent piano player, and he and his brother and their friend Frankie are songwriters. So this is how they often pass their time. Wally's parents are vaudevillian actors, and so he comes from a very musical family. So this is right up his alley. And this jingle contest has the benefit of offering a stateside government job to the winner, which means he can serve the military, but he would be safe in doing so and not have to worry about his condition. It's exactly the right opportunity for him to hopefully uh, get out of it. At that time, there were a lot of contests like this, where people could win contests and get famous, and radio was, there was no television, so there was radio, there was television, but not to the degree now. uh, 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 Radio was really it. And so he was really excited by this opportunity. And in terms of what he gets into, I'll share a little bit of the story. Is that this contest is a government front for allowing the government to put secret messages into their jingles, which is something that Wally winds up getting to be part of. And that isn't something that I'm aware of the government doing, but they did a whole lot of other things to create secret messages, codes, and the like. Some people have heard about the Navajo code talkers. This is one way that the American military was able to send secret messages across the theaters of war that their enemies could not interpret or translate, because nowhere else did the Navajo language exist than in the US. Story in ways in which someone like Wally might persevere. It just seemed um, like a wonderful opportunity to share the power of music to unite and end war, and to create opportunity at a time when things were not harmonious, and where, there was a lot of music being written back then, but to use it to actually help win the war seemed like a really exciting opportunity. So I started to do a lot of investigation into all the kinds of coding, secret messages, even on the Axis side with the Enigma machine, and ways in which secret messages could and couldn't be shared. It just started to form. I started to talk to some people, research, doing my research, finding ways to incorporate music into the story, and it took off from there.
Do you have, I mean, reading into your bio, I couldn't determine if you have any musical background yourself, or is that something you had to learn as well?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, no. I own a piano. I don't know how to play the piano. It's one of my retirement projects. Someday I'll learn to play the piano. I'm saying it now here on your podcast. I'm committing to learning how to play the piano. But no, for this book, I actually had to talk to a lot of people who I know who do play the piano, just to understand that process of composition, the standards of that. And it's slightly different with songs, full length songs, than for jingles. And I feature both of those in my story. So in order to keep that authentic, I had to dive in pretty deep into how that works, and it was really part of the fun part of the research for this book.
Some of this is based on your own family history and your grandfather. Can you tell us about your grandfather and how that inspired you to write these stories?
Yeah, I think I can credit my grandfather with my interest in historical fiction, particularly around World War II. He died when my mother was just a child, so she never got to know him. But he fought and died in Italy during the war. Italy does feature in my book as well. But he died without my mom really knowing him. My grandmother had gone on to be remarried, so I never got a lot of my grandfather's stories. And only in recent years, where I was able to invoke the Freedom of Information Act and gain access to my grandfather's records, did I learn any more about him. And unfortunately, it wasn't much more. It was just the facts of his life: name, rank, serial number, where he died. Perhaps the most interesting thing was what he had in his pocket, which were photos, money, and a pocket knife. Really, not much of anything. So I didn't get to know him or know his stories much, and that got me really thinking about what his life might have been like. This pondering was furthered because I'm also named after my grandfather, who was also a Herb. So I've always just been fascinated to tell whatever stories I could, even if I had to make them up, about my grandfather and what kind of adventures he might have had. So that's kind of part of where I went with this book, is what kind of person might he have been.
That's really wonderful. How did that feel like to not having met your grandfather, but being able to at least give him new life this way?
Yeah. Well, it's gratifying in some ways. I've always felt some connection to him. And as I was investigating the facts of the war and the places where he fought, I was really able to kind of put myself in the mindset of what would that have been like for me. He certainly must have been scared. He had never traveled abroad. He had never been outside of the United States and barely out of New York. And so as I started thinking about the what that must have felt like at a time where travel for pleasure was not typical for people unless they were wealthy, that was kind of the condition of my main character. How would he have felt being asked to fight in a land that he'd never been to against people he didn't know for purposes he was confused by? Um, my family's Jewish, so obviously there was a stake for them in the war. And what's really interesting is I've gotten to see my grandfather's final resting place. He was buried in Italy, where many fallen soldiers were buried because they didn't ship people's bodies or remains back to the United States back then. So a lot of soldiers that fell in World War II are buried in the countries in which they fought. And that was true for my grandfather too. And in the grave where he's buried, it's at an American cemetery, and it's a sea of white crosses, although his grave marker is a Jewish star. And it's one of the few Jewish stars among the crosses. And that just was felt profound to me, to have someone who's Jewish fighting in a war where Jews were particularly persecuted in a land he'd never been in. That to me was really a profound thought process as a person, as his grandson. And so I integrated some of that into my story as well.
I want to shift back to the music. On the cover, there's a piano coming down from the sky with a parachute attached to it. And I just thought, oh, that's just a silly way to show the reader that it's got pianos in it. But then I read your blog about Victory Vertical special pianos built by Steinway and Sons. That actually happened. They dropped pianos. Tell me more about that.
This was some of the most amazing research, right? And there's things that happen as a writer that are just serendipitous. And this was a fact from the war that I found so compelling. Steinway, who was a manufacturer of pianos even back then, was prohibited from producing pianos in the 40s because of the war effort. Roosevelt directed all wood and metals to be handed over and manufacturing handed over to the war effort. So the manufacturing of pianos stopped for a while. Well, Steinway managed to convince the government that soldiers overseas, and particularly for long deployments, need music. They felt like they could convince the government of this fact, and the government bought off on that. And so they permitted a couple thousand of these pianos to be created, and they weren't typical. They were made of different materials and made more sturdy so that they could survive the difficulties of travel and of deployment in theaters of war. And these pianos were delivered to every theater of war during World War II. Sometimes they were shipped, sometimes they were driven, and yes, sometimes they were dropped in crates through with a parachute into these theaters of war where the men would uh, open up the crates, set up their pianos, and have music in their camps. Absolutely fascinating. And to me, right on the theme for me, which is the power of music, particularly during war. We take music for granted now, but imagine, you don't have time or locations to play music, to hear music. And here now in the middle of the battlefield, you've got a piano, and someone that can play the piano can bring music to that theater of war. And now they've got a little respite in this terrifying existence, brought to them courtesy of music. So I thought that was a fascinating piece of information. And there's a museum not far from where I live called the Museum of Making Music, and they happen to have one of these pianos on display. So I've actually gotten to see its size and shape and how it was painted, and just fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it's such an interesting little piece of history that few people probably know about. I certainly had no idea. Um,
Yeah.
and just brings a little humanity into such an inhumane thing. Well, let's talk more about your research. I saw that you spent some time at the New York Public Library. You just mentioned another museum you went to. Sounds like you able to travel to do some research? What other kind of places did you go?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in New York, and our New York Public Library is absolutely amazing. I went to several of the locations for the library. The library in Brooklyn, where I started my research, gave me a little bit of the lay of the land of Brooklyn in the 40s. So, New York, as we know it today, isn't exactly what it was like in the 40s. Bridges were still being built, subways were not all in place. Most were, surprisingly, but the town was even different. So, but my research started there, and I got to work with a wonderful researcher there who helped me look through old maps, areas of New York that would help me understand how my characters would get around because they go between Brooklyn and Manhattan. And also I was able to look at a periodical called the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which is no longer around. And they had a grant to digitize the entire run of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, with one notable exception. That grant did not include the inserts that go into those newspapers. The inserts was where the government would instruct people on how to behave during air raids, how to save their nylons or their tins for the war effort. It was really fascinating. They happened to have the originals there, but they weren't digitizing them. So they permitted me to make copies of those, which I used a lot in my research. Wally winds up being an air raid warden in my story, and the instructions for the air raid warden were also in the library. So it wound up being a really great source of information. I also went to another library in Brooklyn, not in Brooklyn, but in Uptown New York, where I was able to get some manuscripts and information about camp shows. These are the traveling musical shows that would go from camp to camp across Europe and other theaters of war. You might remember actors like Bob Hope would go on tour with the USO and do music and singing and things like that. That comes into play into my story as well. And so I got to do some research there for that. So New York was the focus of a lot of my research. I'd also traveled a bit to Italy. I lived in England for a year of my life, so I was able to draw from some of those experiences in both England and Italy, also feature in my story. So I was fortunate that I had firsthand experience, at least with modern day locations, and uh, that made it a little bit easier to get some of the historic information from those same places for my research.
So much work goes into putting a novel together. That's incredible. Tell me about your journey to publication. This isn't your first novel, and you've already mentioned that you were writing it during the height of the pandemic, which was now several years ago. What have been some of the ups and downs? What have you learned? What has it been like for you to bring this through to publication?
Yeah, I started off writing when I was young, as many writers will tell you they've done, and I got my degree in English with an emphasis in creative writing, mostly in fiction. But immediately after college, I started writing screenplays because I really was fascinated with them. And I got my screenwriting certificate from UCLA. I managed to enter my screenplays into several writing contests and had some great luck with those. I pitched to different studios. It was really great, and for what it was worth, you could say I had some success as a screenwriter, but didn't sell anything. So for me, that wasn't the success I was after. I really wanted to get my work out there. And challenges with screenplays is you can write a great screenplay, but no one's ever going to know it unless it's made into a movie. And that process is a separate process from writing the screenplay. So, as I started to realize that my effort was never, there was no guarantees that my effort would manifest in something that others would get to experience, I pivoted back to writing fiction. I took some fiction writing courses at UC Irvine, which is near where I live in California, and learned a lot about the connections between writing for the screen and writing for the page, although they're different. And I found that some of the skills that I had learned as a screenwriter were useful, and some of the habits I had formed were not useful. So I was able to kind of balance the education I got from both screenwriting and from novel writing, and try to incorporate them into my work. So, given the success that I had from contests and the attention that screenwriting contests got me, my first novel, which is called The French Girls' War, I also entered into a contest. This one was a novel writing contest through Amazon, and I was a quarter finalist in their Breakthrough Novel Award. So that was really gratifying and validating, because my first book was an experiment, having written maybe 5 or 10 screenplays before that. It was a test, and it seemed to go well, and I got a lot of attention for that. Was excited by that. And then had to take a break. Life intervened. I have my two parents. My father had been ill during that time, so I spent a lot of time with him, and then returned to writing this book. As I said, during COVID, which he was still ill, and wound up dying from COVID during the writing of the book. So I've dedicated this book to him during that time. But Jingle Boys also was a finalist in the Page Turner Award contest. So that was nice, and that kind of attention just is great for writers to bring some attention to their work. It's hard enough to find your space there. I elected to publish independently versus traditionally. I had a lot of friends that had tried and failed to be successful traditionally, and the benefits of independent publishing were clear. You have full control over things. You can decide how long your book is available, whether it's available, when it's available. You get final say, and the buck stops with you as the author. And I really liked that kind of accountability. I also liked that kind of control, I guess you'd say. And I was able to work with cover artists, which isn't my forte, but I love working with other people who are artistic in their own way, and that kind of partnership is wonderful. So I enjoy that part of the process. I work with editors the same as I would have if I was publishing traditionally. They're just people that I found and hired for their expertise. And so, I got to build my own team of editors, advanced copy readers, marketing professionals, and people that helped me put the book together, cover artists and the like. And that for me felt it's certainly a separate part of the writing process, but also an enjoyable part for me. I think not every writer wants to deal with any of those things, and I respect that entirely. But for me, the book isn't just the research or the writing, it's the final product and what it brings to the market. So for me, I had an interest in that, and an appreciation for it. So independent publishing has been for me.
Well, congratulations on the success you've had with the awards and just getting your book out into the world. Um, have you decided which direction to go next? Is it going to be another novel? Do you want to try screenplays again? Maybe something else, a play?
Yeah, I'll never say no to screenwriting. I really do love the act of screenwriting, but most screenplays are around 100 pages, and I'm paced for novels now, and where screenplays are sort of outlines and dialogue for the most part, where the director, it's the tool for the director. The novel is an opportunity to paint in between. You can get into inner dialogue, you can get into multiple points of view, you can do things describing, the landscape in ways that you just don't do in a screenplay. So I've really enjoyed that part of the novel process. So I intend to continue with novel writing. I've really liked writing in the World War II period. As we've discussed today, there's been so many new things to find out for me about a period of time that's 80 years in the past now, and there's still new stories to tell and new research to dig up. So for me, I still find that fascinating, and I'm sticking with that. I'm writing another book right now, which I'm hoping will be the first in a trilogy, also taking place in World War II. and with similar themes to my prior novels as well.
Well, Herb, thanks for joining me. Congratulations on your novel. Thank you for your grandfather's sacrifice, and congratulations on Jingle Boys.
Great. Thanks, Colin. I really appreciate it. Great to talk to you.